lovely to see you. I have been mired in a good way in listening to your podcast and reading everything that you've written, both before we asked you to do this event and since. And so I'm glad to just have this time to really widen the lens on the issues of education and get your important perspectives. So I want to start with an easy question. They'll all be easy. As we look back to 2 years ago at the onset of the pandemic, there were a lot of predictions about what would happen in a lot of areas, including education. And one prediction that I would say hasn't come to pass is that we'd be in an era of reimagination and dramatic change in public education. And I'd love you to talk about why, as historians and careful observers, you think that is.
Yeah, maybe I'll kick off our team answer on this one. I guess I always think of the supply side and the demand side when thinking about innovation in education. And if we're thinking about the supply side, there's a lot of supply. But one of the challenges there is that there isn't really a central hub. There isn't a ton of coherence, right? The number of organizations that are trying to move their innovations into the schools is pretty staggering. And if we consider the fact that, right, that's if we just look around one school district, right? We can take Boston or we can take any school district. The number grows as you move across 13,000 of those school districts. And the result can be a lot of fragmentation. And so one of the challenges then is, how can we try to create a little bit of coherence here with regard to the kinds of innovations that we collectively, all of us, including students who are often overlooked and who are not being overlooked today, which I think is fabulous. How can we collectively try to identify the things that are priorities for all of us in public education? Because of course, public education belongs to all of us, whether or not we have children of our own in the schools at the moment. That's a big challenge. And then I think equally large as a challenge is addressing the demand side. And maybe it's an even more challenging obstacle to tackle, because the main obstacle with regard to the lack of demand for innovation is the fact that teachers have no time, right? If teachers are the front line, as you have alluded to, where is the bandwidth that they have, right? We know that American teachers are on for approximately 40% more than their average counterpart across the world. Where's the slack in the system that allows them to think a little bit, to talk a little bit, to experiment a little bit, to try things outside of their classroom, to watch colleagues teach, to talk with young people about how they're experiencing whatever this thing is that they're trying out in their classrooms? On top of that, in terms of thinking about demand there, we have to remember that educational reform is sedimentary, right? Like each layer continues to be there as we move through time. And we can see this in our schools, right? So like, look around in a schoolroom, anything that's there, including the chalkboard, if you've still got one, is the result of a reform that swept through schools at some point. And so we are always dealing then with not just today's innovations, but all of the things that have built up over the decades, right, over the generations, that remain a part of what we're asking educators to do inside classrooms. Let me very briefly, and I can see Jennifer falling asleep as she often does when I make overly long speeches, but just to flip this on its head, let me offer a completely different answer and say, our schools are also full of innovation, right? Like, we just don't know how to value it or capture it or sustain it. But we have 3.5 million professionals in 100,000 schools across the United States, right? There is tons of innovation happening every single day. And one of the things that I would love would be if the research community, if the educational policy community could work more to capture what's going on there, to honor what's going on there, and to try to build out even more support for the kind of innovation that is happening.
So I would answer that slightly differently. I think there is nothing you can say to a teacher right now that irritates them more than just to sort of pronounce that nothing innovative happened during the pandemic, or even just to say that remote learning was a total disaster. Because, in a lot of ways, it freed people up to do things they had never done before. And so to just write all of that off as a loss is such a huge mistake. And I think one of the things that I really worry about is you feel that narrative congealing right now, that the takeaway from the pandemic in education is that it was a disaster. And some research came out just today. I'm actually going to put it in the chat when I finish telling you about it. It's from a friend of Jack's who's at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His name is Thad Domina. Is that correct? Am I pronouncing that correctly? So, they found something really interesting when they looked at the impact of the pandemic on education. And the main takeaway was that simply, like, who went to remote learning was not the primary driver of who gained and who lost ground, that instead it was the ability of schools and systems to respond resiliently. And that meant, were they able to summon all of the collective resources that their students needed to weather a time of disaster? And, we're not having that conversation right now at all. And so I think I would really encourage people not to focus too narrowly on what innovations did and didn't happen, and rather to get us back to that big, if we're going to survive the next pandemic and even this sort of make it through the fallout of the pandemic, we very much need to change the conversation to resilience. But let's please find a less sort of, a buzzword, right? Like a slightly less irritating word.
We're all working on our language, so appreciate that, and lots of good nuggets in there, and including late breaking research that we're all getting a chance to learn about. I think one of the things we hope in the breakout sessions that follow, we really get to hear the voices of educators that can share some of those innovations that Jack talked about that happen in many places, but really lift them up and learn from them, so that we are cognizant of what we shouldn't lose from their experiences over the past 2 years. Jennifer, just thinking about changing the word, but of innovations, but these sort of changes that are afoot, makes me think about kind of a fundamental question that we might all want to ground ourselves in, and that is, what's the purpose of public schools? How do we come back to that? On my car ride in today, I was listening to Dana Goldstein on Fresh Air, and she was alluding to this as well. And so just love you to talk both a little bit about how you'd answer that question.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because my education journey actually started a decade ago. And some of you may know that I started really as kind of like a snarky blogger. And one of the things that I was taking aim at was what felt to me like a suffocating bipartisan consensus around the idea of what schools do. And to me, it felt impossibly narrow. And it was this idea that schools are places where kids go to learn math and English as measured by test scores. And that's how you define a good school. And you define a good teacher on their ability to make those test scores go up. And at the time, I was working for one of the statewide teachers unions, the AFT. I edited their statewide newspaper. So I got to spend a lot of time visiting urban schools. I was spending a lot of time in Lawrence in the period before the state was poised to take over. And I could tell that the conversations that people were having in the communities, teachers, community leaders, students, religious leaders, were so much bigger, that what they envisioned for their schools was so wildly out of step with the way that policymakers were defining what a school does. And I think fast forward today, as we're having the same conversation now about Boston, that mismatch is really the source of the discontent that continues to percolate in Lawrence, but it's also a big part of what you hear people in Boston saying. Like, wait a second, before you start talking about receivership, we need to agree on what our definition of what a good school is, because frankly, your efforts to define a good school in terms of the ability to raise test scores really has not produced a lot. So I would encourage us to have a definition that's much broader, much more explicitly linked to democracy. And one of the things you'll notice with the intense culture wars that are flaring up all over the country, including in Massachusetts, we haven't paid enough attention to that, is that conservatives have quite a well fleshed out vision of what they think schools should do, and more importantly, what they think schools shouldn't do. And that those of us who are focused on advocating for the institution of public education are caught a little bit on our heels, because our conversation has been like, well, there's too much testing, or where our conversation has been dominated by people who've really, like, that's all they've had to talk about, right, is testing or the management structure of schools. And so suddenly when we're in these heated fights over things like content, over things like values, we are a little bit out of practice. Now, I know that Jack has many things to say on this topic, and just letting him answer this is probably going to take up the rest of the showcase.
We're done.
So
I'll try to keep it brief. This is a particular area of interest of mine. I'll just say a couple things. One is that we ought to care what stakeholders in the system think the purpose of education is, right? That educators and young people and building leaders and district leaders and the public ought to all have a say in what we value in education. And there's a reason why education is democratically governed in this country. And we just happen to not have fabulous systems right now for empowering the people with regard to what education looks like. We've done a really good job of empowering the state to see in this really, right, we should put scare quotes around see, right, to see in this very limited way. So what is a state commissioner of education going to be able to see in the schools? Well, he or she could travel around every single school day of the year and whip in and out of schools and still not see every school in a single year. And so they have to rely on a pretty narrow presentation of data. And right now it's extremely narrow. And so I think one of the aims here in including everybody is to actually transform, not just our common understanding of what a school does, but to transform our measurement and accountability systems, which do so much to constrain what education looks like. And I'll just make one other point, because Jennifer's right. I really could go on endlessly about this. So I'll just say that, right now we have a situation where we are particularly guilty of narrowing the aims of education for a particular population of young people, right? Go out to Weston or Wellesley or Winchester or any community that begins with a W, it seems like, and you're not going to see policymakers talk about the aims of education in the same way that you will often hear policy elites talk about the education of racially minoritized, historically marginalized, low-income kids, children with disabilities, and other populations for whom our society often accepts far less than the powerful would ever accept for their own children. And so when we're thinking about what a school is and what a school does and what the purpose of education is, I think that we really need to attend to how do we define this, those of us who are in positions of privilege, how do we define this for our own kids? And do we hold ourselves to that same definition for everybody? I'm not going to call anybody out here other than somebody extremely powerful or who at least used to be extremely powerful. Look at the way Barack Obama talked about education and narrowed the aims of education with regard to what a good teacher does inside classrooms, right? His education chief, Arnie Duncan, talked about good teachers and bad teachers as being, good value-added or bad value-added teachers as measured by student standardized test scores. And President Obama sent his own two girls to Sidwell Friends School, right? A Quaker school with a mission that is an inclusive school that, to my knowledge, is actually a pretty racially diverse school, despite being an expensive private school, that has a fabulous arts program, a theater program, every sport imaginable, an incredible campus, beautifully designed buildings, right? That same kind of care should be taken for every young person. And I think that we as a society have really fallen down on the job with regard to crafting a single definition of what a good school is.
So we promised you all real conversation. We're getting a real conversation and important perspectives. I hope this is getting folks' minds going and that you're thinking about questions to put in the chat. Because we all want to hear them, but I think one of the things you said, Jack, reminds me of some of the conversations, both cheerleading for and maybe admonishment of our work in arts education, right? Is this like, well, how is that helping with X, Y, or Z? And I think that notion of like, what would we want for an excellent education for all students really drove our work and has driven our work in that area. That's just a very small slice. But I think that thinking about the purpose of education around, democratic citizenry and excellent opportunities for all is really important. And you talked about the measurements that we have available, and that I think we've done some work to kind of elbow out a little bit what that could be, including your work, Jack, which is how we first met through the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative, there's that word again, Innovative Education Assessment, where you brought together district teams to think about how to measure schools differently. And so how do you think we should be thinking about what makes a school a good school and what's missing in our current approaches to define and measure that?
Yeah, again, I'll have to sort of rein myself in. Maybe I'll stick to just three big ideas about measurement and accountability, where I think we've fallen short in our society. One is validity, right? And I mean this in the psychometric sense, that you measure what you say you're measuring. And we simply don't have valid measures of school quality, right? Most of our measures of school quality, at least in terms of state accountability systems, are really measures of family income, racial privilege, the degree to which students have disabilities or not, the degree to which families are speaking English at home or not, parental educational attainment. None of these things tell us anything about the quality of the education that is happening in the school, right? But we pretend that we can look at a school's rating by DESE here in Massachusetts, or their A through F rating in many states like Florida, where it started, or that we can go online to, let's say, greatschools.org and look at their 1 through 10 ratings of schools, right? I could talk for a very long time about all the problematic things we do, including reducing school quality to a single number or letter, right? But at the root of this is this challenge of validity, right? Are you measuring what you say you're measuring? And in most cases, we're not. I think a second big challenge here is equity, right? That we ought to be pursuing measurement and accountability systems that build capacity rather than punching down, right? Is really what our current measurement and accountability systems do, largely because of the validity challenge, right? But also because even if we measure what we're saying we're measuring, we don't take enough care with regard to what the impact of that is going to be. We would if it were reversed in terms of the impact, right? If we were to say, let's slap a label of racially segregated on every predominantly white school in the Commonwealth, right? You bet there would be a real conversation about some of the unintended consequences of that, right? And about how unhappy particular constituencies would be. But we don't take the same level of care with regard to the unintended consequences of treating schools that serve historically marginalized kids and presently marginalized kids. And so I think concern with equity is something that is in some places in education, but is not really yet in our measurement and accountability systems. There's a kind of veneer of it, right? Measurement and accountability is ostensibly being done for that purpose, but in terms of how it plays out, it has the opposite effect most of the time. And then the third big idea that I would talk about, and that I do talk about, is democracy, right? Where's the democratic element in the process? Where's the public in public accountability, right? Most states have algorithms that determine accountability. I don't view that as a particularly public mechanism, right? Why aren't stakeholders able to engage in a process of conversation and deliberation? Why don't stakeholders have a say in accountability determinations, right? We trust stakeholders with that kind of responsibility in lots of other places. Think about the fact that juries exist and the responsibilities that they are vested with, right? We can't trust local people to have some say in accountability determinations. I think it's insulting and undemocratic. And the way we see that really play out is when communities of color or low-income communities whose schools are so often denigrated by our measurement and accountability systems end up saying, no, don't close our school down. This is not a bad school, right? And they're often told, no, actually, our algorithm knows better than you do. And so I think we really need to be conscious of the democratic element of public education in this country when we're thinking about measurement and accountability.
I would add one more piece to that. The story of the fallout from the pandemic has been told largely in terms of angry parents. But in many cases, we're totally missing what happened, several years back, that a number of the communities where the most intense backlash is playing out now are places where students banded together and organized and signed petitions and protested and said, you're falling short. You are not preparing us to live in the real world. It isn't, it's not right for us to attend a school that has an A grade attached to it, but we've never encountered a teacher of color. Right, I'm thinking of a community in Wisconsin, or a place like Milton, Mass. Right, where it's students who are really the ones demanding, they're defining equity and putting the pressure on the adults in the building to enact policies. And what we're seeing, that is so unfortunate, is now this intense backlash, often led by parents who are saying, wait a second, I'm not willing to give up mine, or wait a second, let's put the brakes on culture, right? And so I'm so excited that you have got a group of students, because I really feel like it is more important than ever that students in this post-pandemic period be the ones to redefine where we go next, because in many ways we can very legitimately make the case that the system has failed. And as Marinell, as you put it, right, that in a place like Boston, if the solutions haven't delivered what they were supposed to deliver over the course of 20 years, maybe it's time to give the mic to the stakeholders who are the most directly involved in the system. And I think that one of the things that we will quickly learn is that their vision of the problem is much bigger than the one that we've been tossing around, but also their solutions look very different from the ones that we so often read about in the Globe. And I better just stop there.
Well, I'm wondering, just going back to what you shared some really big thinking, Jack, about what some of those issues might be in our current accountability approaches, and Jennifer, what you just said is like a bigger definition and solutions that we're not used to. Like in your work, have you seen examples? Do you know of places to look that that really help us take from the big idea into a more concrete examples of how that plays out in new and different ways?
Well, I'll test out this possible answer and see if it holds any water. This is something I said to my graduate students the other night. I just finished a new book with a colleague named Ethan Hutt, and we were writing about how assessment so often undermines learning for young people. And our editor asked us, can you think of a positive example? And I'm sure there are, dozens, hundreds, thousands of schools that do a great job. I'm sure there are hundreds or thousands of classrooms inside schools where incredible things are happening. But in terms of a sort of more systematic answer, the one I landed on was, look what happens inside our kindergartens, right? It's like kids actually want to go to school. They line up and sort of, at least the school across the street from my house, where I can watch them queuing up, they kind of run away from their parents and often hug their teachers. When I have visited kindergarten classrooms, young people are really busy, hard at work with stuff that feels really relevant and interesting and engaging to them. And I said this to my PhD students the other night because I realized, like, oh, that's what we do in PhD seminar. Now their parents aren't dropping them off and they're not hugging me as they come into class. But a lot of the other things are pretty similar in terms of their broad contours, right? That they're engaged in work that feels really relevant and real to them, that feels valuable. They feel respected. They feel like they have a lot of agency with regard to what we're doing. They get some measure of control over what's happening in the classroom. And so I've been thinking lately about how well we do the two ends of the system, which, it's not a direct answer to your question, but like, I think there are lots of places where education works in this really authentic and powerful way for young people. A amazing educator, mentor of mine, friend of our podcast, the late Mike Rose, wrote beautifully about schools that he visited across the country, where inside classrooms, magic was happening, right? Young people were excited about what they were doing, and they felt like they were actually having their own interests pursued through the curriculum, through the care that educators were showing for them, through their engagement with other classmates. And they felt like something, that I can only describe as broadening was happening, right? Suddenly they were seeing bigger possibilities for their lives. And so, I think things are happening all over the place, all the time. It's just that we do so much in education to constrain the magic, and it's often because we're so afraid of where the floor will be that we're willing to squeeze everybody towards the middle. And I think I'm a little bit less worried. I maybe have a little more faith in educators than most people do. I think that if we allow educators to teach, and we do things to support them as professionals, right? Both before they enter the profession and while they're in the profession. We do things to build their capacity. We do things to support their ability to teach, including giving them adequate resources. And one such resource is a small enough class size to actually have relationships with your students. I think that if we do that, yeah, there will be classrooms where things are a mess. But I think there will be a lot more classrooms where we restore a little bit of the magic that we tend to see at these two poles, at the very end of the system and at the very beginning of the system.
I think one of the reasons that I was so interested and frankly kind of excited by that research I mentioned out of North Carolina was that by defining the problem differently, there were so many interesting insights into how to measure success. And the idea that a successful system is the one that does the best job responding collectively to needs on a bigger scale, I thought it just opened up a lot of possibilities. But I also realized that I saw that in action during the pandemic because I have a very close relationship with one of the special education collaboratives in Massachusetts, Valley Collaborative in Billerica. I worked there for a year doing some journalism work with students, and I've done their newsletter for years. And so when they're exactly the kind of school that you would have thought would have been a disaster during the pandemic. They serve a range of students, many of whom have extraordinary needs. And yet, when schools shut down, they gathered together as a faculty and a staff. And the question that they tried to respond to was, okay, the single most important thing that we do here is form relationships with our students. We can't do that in person right now. So how else can we get there? And they really did get there. And part of it is that because their mission is different than more traditional schools in Massachusetts, they actually have more room to experiment. They also have, they have. I wouldn't say they have a huge budget, but the idea is that because students need this kind of adult connection, their ratio, staff-student ratio, can be as little as 1-to-1, right? And that's something that's very difficult to scale up if we're going to put it in innovation terms. But again, yeah, I would say that the examples of innovation and success really are out there, and that we need to cast a bigger net as far as how we define the problem. And I go back to a place like Lawrence, which right now, once again, is having this very, conversation about the future of the schools, and in many ways feels very disappointed. And I think that if their stakeholders had a louder say way back when the state took over, that the measurement of what constituted success would have looked different, and the results might have looked different as well.
Well, both of your sets of comments are so rich, but I think that they also connect to a couple of the ideas that are in the chat right now, if you all can see them. One, for our historian, sort of harkens back to a junior high that was organized differently, and sort of makes the point, we don't learn from each other. Jennifer, I think you just posited someone we might learn from, and maybe, so one thought is like, why does that not happen? And then Larry Myatt, who folks may know was one of the founders of Fenway High School, and did a lot of, I will put in quotes, innovation loosely, but important work here in Boston, and has some interesting observations about, in the era since NCLB, sort of how have we trusted or not trusted educators, and how willing have they been to push for more than, a mild adaptation to what we've been doing. So wondering if either of you have things that you would pick up on those important kind of examples and observations in the landscape.
Jack, you go ahead with this one, and then I'm going to be all over Meg Griffith's question.
All right, sure. So I have a couple responses. One is that families tend to actually be pretty conservative with regard to education. I don't mean politically, right? Because we've all gone through school, and there are cultural notions about what a quote unquote real school looks like. What that means is that it can be pretty hard to sell communities on a vision of education that looks markedly different from what parents and caregivers themselves experienced in school, right? There's one challenge. Another challenge is that if we're going to do things that are different from, we'll just sort of use the broad term, the status quo, then, to my mind, those things ought to be responsive to local context. Well, one of the challenges then is that local context changes, and education being, a large, bureaucratic, taxpayer-funded project isn't particularly nimble, right? It's a little bit like a battleship that you're trying to turn. And if local context is changing, right, it can be a little hard to create a school that really meets the needs of the local community now without potentially undermining the needs of the local community 5 years from now, 10 years from now. That's not to say it's an impossible thing to do. But, I think that's one of the big challenges that we need to recognize, is that constantly reinventing schools is not only difficult because, schools should be serving the people in the local community, and those people do change sometimes. Heck, I live in a very rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in Somerville. And our neighborhood has totally changed in the last 10 years, not in a way that I'm particularly happy about, but it's changed. And so when you couple that with the fact that Americans are fairly conservative, and it may be true of people around the world, but I study US education with regard to what a real school is, you've got a challenge on your hands. Couple that with one more challenge, which is that because things like infrastructure matter, and because we've already made such tremendous investments in infrastructure, right? It can be difficult to say, okay, well, we're gonna toss out this school, or the way our classrooms are designed, or when you've got something that is serviceable. Again, that's not to say like, well, you've just got to stick with what you've got, or that infrastructure dictates everything. But I think just mapping out the challenges can be really important, so that we can then think about, all right, well, what are the ways we want to think a little bit more creatively within the constraints that we've got, right? Parents probably won't go for a curriculum that has not been divided up into subjects. Maybe they will, right? But my guess is in most cases they won't. They're going to say, where's the math, right? Where's the English classroom? Where's the history classroom? So if we recognize a constraint like that, then what can we do? Can we say, gosh, it doesn't make sense to chop up the school day into 5 or 6 or 7 different blocks. Maybe we want to think about combining particular subjects, or maybe we want to have students working on interdisciplinary projects. Another couple of mentors of mine, David Tyack and Larry Cuban, talked about incremental change, right? Slow change, steady change, small change as being really valuable. And I think that that's something that is underappreciated in educational policy and in school reform, is thinking about just how important and how powerful small changes are, and freeing up educators and school leaders to engage in small acts of creativity, in experimentation, such that, maybe we aren't reinventing the system at any time, but we're making these small changes, which by accretion actually do end up making schools markedly different 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later.
Jennifer, in 2 minutes or less, you get to talk about the issues of the day in the wider context.
I can do it. So I never dreamed when I was coming up in the world that I would someday co-host a podcast and write a book with an education historian. But I can't tell you how useful it's turned out to be, because whenever you see these flare-ups around schools, and they happen over and over and over again, there's always some essential unresolved question bubbling below the surface. And the really big one here is, who gets to call the shots? Is it parents, or is it the state? And there I'm using the state interchangeably with schools. And so we really have never figured that out. And now we're at a moment where there is intense distrust of institutions that has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and a level of polarization that we really haven't seen in modern memory. And so all of those things are playing out. And I think it makes for a really dangerous time. But I would encourage people to go back to even in the 90s, we had a similar version of this play out, and a movement that looked like it couldn't fail really did, because what happened was that, just like today, the more an abstract concept like parents' rights turns out to be about banning particular books or keeping particular things that one parent feels uncomfortable with out of the school for all kids, the more the majority of people come to see that as a problem. And I think that, just like in the 90s, that's what we're starting to see now. And it's our job to really speak up on behalf of honest history and democratic values, and show them visibly and let them hear audibly that those loud voices that they hear, screaming in front of school boards, are not the majority. And I think that's my 2 minutes right there.
Well, that was incredible to do in 2 minutes or less. And for folks who are more interested in learning more about these issues and exploring them, I just can't recommend Jack and Jennifer's podcast, Have You Heard Enough? It's my, regular dog walking activity once a week to listen to, and you get a real deep dive around a whole range of the things that you've talked about today that leave us with no easy answers, because there aren't easy answers in education, and that's why we need so many of us to be engaged in it. So I really am grateful for your time, and know that we've flash forward to what's going to happen next, which is to hear the voices of educators and young people through our panel discussion. So in just a couple of